We want to turn now to the unrelenting heat dome engulfing much of the nation that shows no signs of letting up. More than 125 million Americans are under these heat alerts tonight in more than a dozen states. Here's CBS's Carter Evans.
As the unrelenting heat wave enters its 40th consecutive day in the southern U.S., the temperature is expected to reach a record-setting 119 in Palm Springs, where hiking trails are closed, but road crews are still on the job. The pavement they're working on is 142 degrees. Jose Sanchez figures he'll need to drink at least 2 gallons of water to stay hydrated.
For the first 4 hours, you're okay, but then the last 4 hours, you got to take a lot of breaks.
No kids on the playground today, and you can understand why. The temperature here on the slide is 171 degrees. Further north in Death Valley, a 71-year-old hiker died after collapsing during his visit in the 121-degree heat. Meanwhile, in Phoenix, temperatures are staying in the triple digits, flirting with a new daily record. And heat-related ER visits are on the rise in the Southwest, up 134% from last week. So far this year, the heat's killed 18 people in Arizona's Maricopa County. The heat straining the power grid. Energy bills are predicted to jump almost 12% this summer.
For more on this dangerous heat, let's bring in meteorologist Chris Warren from our partners at the Weather Channel. Good evening, Chris.
Good evening, Nora. This prolonged and extremely dangerous heat wave likely to stick around for several more days. In fact, the heat dome expands throughout a big portion of the U.S. with potential record heat going from coast to coast. More storms and the potential for damaging winds and some serious flooding, not just possible, but likely in these areas in yellow. We're going to see a couple of rounds of storms from this evening into the morning hours with the potential for thunderstorm after thunderstorm developing overnight during the nighttime hours. The potential for flooding is serious by morning in parts of Kentucky and Tennessee. And that Canadian wildfire smoke, Nora, is going to be sticking around with no significant improvement in the air quality.
This morning, nuclear tensions between the U.S. and North Korea escalating as the U.S. shows its military support for South Korea. The North blasting the U.S. for, quote, reckless military moves after this U.S. nuclear-armed ballistic submarine docked in the Korean peninsula. North Korea's defense minister threatening possible nuclear retaliation.
Rhetoric like that, it's incredibly dangerous. We're not there to instigate.
This is the first time in 4 decades an American nuclear submarine has docked in South Korea. ABC's Martha Raddatz boarding the USS Kentucky for an exclusive look.
This is where the missiles would be launched from.
Yes.
The Kentucky is capable of carrying up to 20 nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles, each of them carrying up to a dozen nuclear warheads. The U.S. military says it's a reflection of American security commitments to South Korea as it fights back against North Korean aggression.
Are you worried about the possibility it could backfire?
I am very confident in our own nuclear deterrence.
The nuclear submarine is more than 200 miles south of the DMZ, or the demilitarized zone, the border that divides South and North Korea. This is where the Pentagon says 23-year-old American soldier Travis King intentionally crossed over into North Korea this week without authorization. Since King was taken into custody, U.S. officials say they've been unable to reach North Korean authorities to secure his release.
We start with South Korea sending its own warning against North Korea after Pyongyang threatened of a nuclear retaliation following the arrival of a U.S. nuclear-capable submarine in the south. Seoul says Pyongyang will face the end of its regime in case of such an attack. Our Lee Soo-jin starts us off.
South Korea's defense ministry responded to North Korea's warning of nuclear retaliation with a warning of its own on Friday. The ministry said that just as South Korea and the U.S. made it clear during the NCG meeting, North Korea will face an immediate, overwhelming, and decisive response in the event of any North Korean nuclear attack against the alliance that will result in the end of the North Korean regime. North Korea has heavily criticized the docking of the USS Kentucky, a nuclear-capable strategic submarine in South Korea, and the launch of the South Korea-U.S. Nuclear Consultative Group as a blatant and direct nuclear threat. North Korea's Defense Minister Kang Sun-nam, in a press statement released by North Korea's state-run Korea Central News Agency on Thursday, called the situation the most serious stage of the U.S. planning and executing a nuclear strike against DPRK. He added that the DPRK's law on nuclear force allows them to take a necessary course of action when it is clear that a nuclear weapons attack on the country has been carried or is imminent. Kang emphasized that the deployment of strategic weapons such as the nuclear-capable submarine falls under the conditions of North Korea's nuclear doctrine that allows the use of nuclear weapons in retaliation. He also said that using military force against North Korea will lead to disastrous consequences for both South Korea and the United States. The USS Kentucky arrived in the southeastern port city of Busan on Tuesday, the first port call from a U.S. ballistic missile submarine in Korea in 40 years. On the same day, the first meeting of the South Korea-U.S. Nuclear Consultative Group was held in Seoul. The Pentagon responded to the statement on the previous day, saying that the submarine's port call to Busan was a planned military exercise stemming from South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol's visit to Washington in April, emphasizing that the move was part of its commitment to extended deterrence in response to North Korea's continued nuclear threats. The port visit was also referred to as a representation of South Korea and the U.S.'s ironclad commitment to defense. The Pentagon also said that South Korea and the U.S.'s efforts to protect their citizens from North Korean nuclear threats do not violate UN Security Council resolutions, unlike North Korea's nuclear provocations.
Is Vladimir Putin planning to attack NATO? It seemed impossible last year. Ukraine alone was a handful for the Russian army. But now new reports have emerged, new statements from Russia. They say Putin will target NATO's soft underbelly, the so-called Achilles heel. And where exactly is that? Let me pull up the map for you. You can see Russia, Belarus, Poland, and the Baltic states. Now focus on this land between Poland and Lithuania. It's called Kaliningrad. This is Russian territory, Kaliningrad. Moscow took this land from Nazi Germany during the Second World War. And since then, it's been theirs. Now, Kaliningrad is surrounded by two NATO states, Poland and Lithuania. But there is a land bridge to Russia's ally, Belarus. This land bridge has a name, the Suwalki Gap, or the Suwalki Corridor. It's around 100 kilometers long. It's sparsely populated, but it's NATO territory. The Suwalki Gap is shared by Poland and Lithuania. It's been called many things. The most dangerous place on earth, NATO's soft underbelly, and NATO's Achilles heel. But why would Putin attack it? Well, for strategic reasons. The Suwalki Gap is the only way to go from Poland to the Baltics, the only land route. If you take that, you can cut off the Baltic states. 3 NATO nations would be isolated from their allies. That's Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. So simply put, it's a choke point. Now, if you're watching us from India, this may sound familiar to you. India, too, has a choke point. This one, called the Siliguri Corridor, also called the Chicken's Neck. This corridor connects India to the northeastern states. What Siliguri is to India, Suwalki is to NATO. But coming back to Putin, what's his plan of action? The Kremlin itself has not said anything, but Russian parliamentarians explained how it would unfold. No Russian soldiers will be used in this operation. Instead, Wagner mercenaries from Belarus will engage. I know it sounds confusing. Didn't Wagner rebel against Putin just recently? Well, this Russian lawmaker claims it was all part of the plan. Wagner would rebel, their fighters would be exiled to Belarus, and once there, they would train. Satellite images show new military camps have popped up in the country in Belarus. Hundreds of Wagner fighters have started moving in. Reports say they could take the Suwalki Gap in hours. The question is, will Putin give the order? Suwalki is still NATO territory. An attack on this area would trigger Article 5 of NATO. What is Article 5? It says an attack on one member is an attack on all NATO members, meaning NATO would be at war with Russia officially. Will Putin risk that? If you Google China today, 9 out of 10 headlines will talk about its economy. Growth below expectations, sinking property prices, and impending slowdown. That's all that the world is talking about. But none of this has stopped China from targeting Taiwan. The provocations continue. Last week, China sent fighter jets, bombers, and warships towards Taiwan. Over the course of 3 days, more than 70 Chinese planes crossed the median line. This is the de facto border between Taiwan and China, the median line. As the threat grows, the world is talking about possible scenarios, and all of these scenarios feature the US. What will America do to contain China? Will it go to war with China over Taiwan? What is America's military strategy vis-a-vis Taiwan? These questions are being asked. Tonight we have some answers. Tonight we want to tell you about what's being called America's wall of defense. This is in the waters around Taiwan. The US is arming allies and building military presence. To understand this wall of defense, let's first understand the lay of the land. This is the region we're talking about, East Asia, already heavily militarized with a sizable presence of US forces. Starting with South Korea. South Korea has about 73 US bases and more than 26,000 American soldiers. Then we have Japan, and double the numbers. Japan has 120 American bases with more than 50,000 US troops. And these are the larger deployments. But US military presence is not limited to these countries. There are bases in the Philippines, Cambodia, Singapore, Brunei, and Guam, which again is a large hub. Guam has about 8,000 US troops. If you connect these dots, you'll see that the Americans have more than a foothold in the region. But that may not be enough to contain China. At least that is Washington's assessment. It remains worried about China's moves. Look at what their latest defense strategy says. It calls China the quote-unquote most comprehensive and serious challenge to the US. I have a copy of that report. Let me quote from what it says. The PRC is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. This is the American assessment. The US recognizes the threat posed by China. The question is, what will they do about it? From what we understand, the US military strategy has two parts. Part one is arming allies, and part two is getting access to more bases. And this plan is already being executed. Take the case of Japan. There is complete shift in its defense posture, a complete shift there. Japan is dumping its pacifist credentials. It is preparing for war with American weapons. Let me show you how. Japan is building a chain of militarized islands. It is loading them with military hardware and facilities. Take a look at this one. It's an island called Ishigaki. Recently, Japan built a garrison here. In March 2023, it also made an announcement. Japan was sending more than 500 members of the Ground Self-Defense Force. Now, that's their version of an army. Japan technically does not have an army. Their constitution does not allow it. They want to change it, but as of today, what they have is something called a self-defense force. It can only be used for defense. It cannot participate in an attack or an offensive operation. But as Japan shifts away from pacificism, its forces are beginning to look like a real army. The troops in Ishigaki, for instance, are being armed. They're getting 150 military vehicles and land-to-ship and land-to-air missile units. Also, America's Patriot missile system. Then we have another island called Yonaguni. It has about 160 Japanese troops. In April this year, they too got a Patriot missile system. Same with the island of Miyako. It has, in fact, the same missile defense system, plus an entire military base with 700 to 800 troops. And anti-ship surface-to-air missile batteries. Also radar and intelligence gathering facilities. Another island called Amami Oshima has similar deployments. Earlier this year, Japan started work on yet another island called Mageshima. Tokyo is building a military base here as well, and I have some pictures. This is what the island of Mageshima looks like. Reports say a military base is being built here. It will be used by the US military for aircraft training. A pre-existing base will be relocated here. There will be new runways, a control tower, and an explosives depot. It will be a full-fledged military facility for the US military. Now look how close it is to Taiwan and the Chinese borders. The goal is quite clear, to be within striking distance of China. In fact, the US is getting access to more bases in the region. Recently, it struck a deal with the Philippines. It got access to 4 more bases. 3 on the island of Luzon, which is close to Taiwan, and 1 in Palawan. This is in the South China Sea. Now, in case you're wondering what America will do with so many bases, let me show you. This is what they're building, America's wall of defense against China. This is what it looks like. 2 chains of interconnected islands, starting from Japan and South Korea in the north to Malaysia, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea in the south. These 2 island chains are supposed to deter China, and this is not a new idea, by the way. It was first proposed in the year 1951 by John Foster Dulles. He later became the US Secretary of State. Some 70 years back, Dulles proposed the island chain strategy. Back then, the objective was to contain both the Soviet Union and China. He wanted a string of naval bases in the Pacific to restrict access to the sea, both for Moscow and Beijing. And now, all these decades later, that plan is being revived. It may or may not work. But China will see this as encirclement, an attempt at containment, which is what it is. So expect Beijing to react sharply. In fact, it's a bit of a catch-22 situation for the world. These attempts to prevent a war might end up provoking one.